Good now? Officially? No problems? Okay, let's. Okay, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Force over here, and welcome reading live stream. It has been a while since I last did a reading live stream in general. Been a few weeks at least. So, yeah, we're back now. Hello, Daniel Barry. How you doing tonight? So we're gonna be doing our. So we're gonna be reading afterward. I would watch afterward. I would watch. I just haven't gotten to the point where it has from moderating a number of places, the few places that I'm moderator for. So yeah, but those days, at least for the time being, seem to be over. Actually, let me do this without my glasses. Hold on a second. Okay. Close enough. Whatever. I know what I know what you need. Elizabeth looked up from her sociology text, startled, and saw a rather nondescript man in a green fatigue jacket. For a moment she thought he looked familiar, as if she had known him before. The feeling was close to deja vu. Then it was gone. He was about her height, skinny and twitchy. That was the word. He wasn't moving, but he seemed to be twitching inside his skin, just out of sight. His hair was black and unkempt. He wore thick horn-rimmed glasses that magnified his dark brown eyes, and the lenses looked dirty. Though she was quite sure she had never seen him before. You know, she said, I doubt that. You need a strawberry double-dipped cone, right? She blinked at him, frankly startled. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she had been thinking about breaking for an ice cream. She was studying for finals in one of the third floor chorales of the student union, and there was still a woefully long way to go. Right. Right? He persisted and smiled. It transformed his face from something over intense and nearly ugly into something else that was oddly appealing. The word cute occurred to her, and that wasn't a good word. If that persists, I may not have a choice. And I really don't want to end the stream just because of that. Right? He persisted and smiled. It transformed his face from something over intense and nearly ugly into something else that was oddly appealing. The word cute occurred to her, and that wasn't a good word to inflict a boy, but this one was when he smiled. Smiled back before she could. He smiled back before she could roadblock it behind her lips. This she didn't need to have to waste time brushing off some weirdo who had decided to pick the worst time of the year to try to make an impression. She still had 16 chapters of Introduction to Sociology to wade through. No thanks, she said. Come on, if you hit them any harder, you'll give yourself a headache. You've been at it 2 hours without a break. How would you know that? I've been watching you, he said promptly, but this time his gammon grin was lost on her. She already had a headache. Well, you can stop, she said more sharply than she had intended. I don't like people staring at me. I'm sorry. She felt a little sorry for him, the way she sometimes felt sorry for stray dogs. He seemed to float in the green fatigue jacket and, yes, he had on mismatched socks. One black, one brown. She felt herself getting ready to smile again and held it back. I've got these finals, she said gently. Sure, he said. Okay. She looked after him for a moment pensively. Then she lowered her gaze to her book, but an after image of the encounter remained. Strawberry double dip. When she got back to the dorm, it was 11:15 p.m., and Alice was on her bed, listening to Neil Diamond and reading the story of O. I didn't know they have signed that in 17, Elizabeth said. Alice sat up. Broadening my horizons, darling. Spreading my intellectual wings. Raising my... Liz? Hmm? Did you hear what I said? No, sorry, You look like someone punked you one, kid. I met a guy tonight. Sort of a funny guy at that. Oh? He must be something if he can separate texts. His name is Edward Jackson Hamner Jr., no less. Short, skinny, looks like he washed his hair last room. Oh, and there's one more round. I thought you were the type. It's something like that, Alice. I was studying at the Union on the third floor, the think tank, and he invited me down to the grinder for an ice cream cone. I told him no and he sort of slunk off. But once he started thinking about ice cream, I couldn't stop. I just decided to give up and take a break, and there he was, holding a big, drippy strawberry double dip in each hand. I trembled to hear the denouncement. Elizabeth snorted. Well, I couldn't really say no, so he sat down, and it turns out he had sociology with Professor Branner last year. Will wonders never cease. Lord have mercy. Go, Goshen to Christmas. Listen, this is really amazing. You know the way I've been sweating that course? Yes. You talk about it in your sleep, practically. I've got a 78 average. I've got to have an 80 to keep my scholarship, and that means I need at least an 84 on the final. While this Ed Hamner says Brenner uses almost the same final every year, and Ed's eidetic. You mean he's got a what's it photographic memory? Yes, look at this. She opened her sociology book and took out 3 sheets of notebook paper covered with writing. Alice took them. This looks like multiple choice stuff. It is. Edward says it's Branner's last year final word for word. Alice said flatly, I don't believe it. But it covers all the material. Still don't believe it. She handed the sheets back. Just because he isn't a spook, don't call him that. Okay. This little guy hasn't gotten you bamboozled into just memorizing this and not studying at all, has he? Of course not, she said uneasily. And even if this is like, I think it's exactly ethical. Anger surprised her and ran away with her tongue before she could hold it. That's great for you, sure. Dean's list every semester and your folks paying your way. You aren't. Hey, I'm sorry. There was no call for that. Alice shrugged and opened the O again, her face carefully neutral. No, you're right. Not my business. Alright, I did see the buffer, so we're gonna read that last bit again. Of course not, she said immediately. And even if this isn't the exam, do you think it's exactly ethical? Her surprised her and ran away with her tongue before she could hold it. You, sure. Dean's list every semester, and your folks paying your way. You aren't. Hey, I'm sorry. There was no call for that. Alice shrugged and opened O again, her face carefully neutral. No, you're right. Not my business. But why don't you study the book too, just to be safe? Of course I will. But mostly she studied the exam notes provided by Edward Jackson Hamner Jr. When she came out of the lab exam, he was sitting in the lobby, floating on his green army fatigue coat. He smiled tentatively at her and stood up. How'd it go? Impulsively, she kissed his cheek. She could not remember such a blessed feeling of relief. I think I aced it. Really? That's great. Like a burger? Love one, she said absently. Her mind was still on the exam. It was the one Ed had given her, almost word for word, and she had sailed through. Over hamburgers, she asked him how his own finals were going. Don't have any. I'm in honors, and you don't take them unless you want to. I was doing okay, so I didn't. Then why are you still here? I had to see how you did, didn't I? Had to see how you did, didn't I? Ed, you didn't. That's sweet, but the naked look in his eyes troubled her. She had it before. She had seen it before. She was a pretty girl. Yes, he said softly. Yes, I did. Ed, I'm grateful. I think you saved my scholarship. I really do. But I have a boyfriend, you know. Serious? He asked with a poor attempt to speak lightly. Very, she said, matching his tone. Almost engaged. Does he know he's lucky? Does he know how lucky? I'm lucky too, she said, thinking of Tony Lombard. Beth, he said suddenly. What? She asked, startled. Nobody calls you that, do they? Why, no, they don't. Not even this guy? No, Tony called her Liz. Sometimes Lizzie, which was even worse. He leaned forward. But Beth is what you like best, isn't it? She laughed to cover her confusion. Whatever in the world? Never mind. He grinned his gammon grin. I'll call you Beth. That's better. Now eat your hamburger. Then her junior year was over and she was saying goodbye to Alice. They were a little stiff together and Elizabeth was sorry. She supposed it was her own fault. She had crowed a little loudly about her sociology final when grades were posted. She had scored a 97, highest in the division. Well, she told herself as she waited at the airport for her flight to be called. It wasn't any more unethical than the cramming she had been resigned to in that third floor corral. Cramming wasn't really studying at all. Just, just, just rote memorization that faded away to nothing as soon as the exam was over. She fingered the envelope that poked out of her purse. Notice of her scholarship loan package for her senior year, $2,000. She and Tony would be working together in Boothbay, Maine this summer, and the money she would earn there would put her over the top. And thanks to Ed Hamner, it was going to be a beautiful summer, clear sailing all the way. But it was the most miserable summer of her life. June was rainy. The gas shortage depressed the tourist trade, and her tips at the Boothbay Inn were mediocre. Even worse, Tony was pressing her on the subject of marriage. He could get a job on or near campus, he said, and with her student aid grant, she could get a degree in style. She was surprised to find that the idea scared rather than pleased her. Something was wrong. She didn't know what, but something was missing out of whack, out of kilter. One night late in July, she frightened herself by going on a hysterical crying jag in her apartment. The only good thing about it was that her roommate, a mousy little girl named Sandra Ackerman, was out on a date. The nightmare came in early August. She was lying on the bottom of an open grave, unable to move. Rain fell from a white sky onto her upturned face. Then Tony was standing over her, wearing his yellow high-impact construction helmet. Marry me, Liz, he said, holding down at her expressionlessly. Marry me or else. She tried to speak, to agree. She would do anything if only he would take her out of this dreadful muddy hole, but she was paralyzed. All right, he said. It's or else then. He went away. She struggled to break out of her paralysis and couldn't. Then she heard the bulldozer. A moment later she saw it, a high yellow monster, pushing a mound of wet earth in front of the blade. Tony's merciless face looked down from the open cab. He was going to bury her alive. Trapped in her motionless, voiceless body, she could only watch in dumb horror. Trickles of dirt began to run down the sides of the hole. A familiar voice cried, Go! Leave her now! Go! Tony stumbled down from the bulldozer and ran. Huge relief swept her. She would have cried had she been able, and her savior appeared, standing at the foot of the front of the open grave like a sexton. It was Ed Hamner, loading in his green fatigue jacket, his hair awry, his horn rim swept down to the small bulge at the end of his nose. He held his hand out to her. Get up, he said gently. I know what you need. Get up, Beth. And she could get up. She sobbed with relief. She tried to thank him. The words spelled out on top of each other, and Ed only smiled gently and nodded. She took his hand and looked down to see her footing. And when she looked up again, she was holding the paw of a huge, slavering timber wolf with red hurricane lantern eyes and thick, spiked teeth open to bite. She woke up, bolt upright in her bed, her nightgown drenched with sweat. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, and even after a warm shower and a glass of milk, she could not reconcile herself to the dark. She slept with the light on. A week later, Tony was dead. She opened the door in her robe, expecting to see Tony, but it was Danny Kilmer, one of the fellows he worked with. Danny was a fun guy. She and Tony had doubled with him and his girl a couple of times. But standing in the doorway of her second floor apartment, Danny looked not only serious but ill. Excuse me. Danny? She said. What, Liz? He said. Liz, you've got to hold on to yourself. You've. God. He pounded the jamb of the door with one big knuckled, dirty hand, and she saw he was crying. Danny, is it Tony? Is something. Tony's dead, Danny said. He was. But he was talking to air. She had fainted. The next week passed in a kind of dream. The story pieced itself together from the woefully brief newspaper account and from what Danny told her over a beer in the Harbor Inn. They had been repairing drainage culverts on Route 16. Part of the road was torn up, and Tony was flagging traffic. A kid driving a red Fiat had been coming down the hill. Tony had flagged him, but the kid never even slowed. Tony had been standing next to a dump truck, and there was no place to jump back. The kid in the Fiat had sustained head lacerations and a broken arm. He was hysterical and also cold sober. The police found several holes in his brake lines, as if they had overheated and then melted through. His driving record was A1. He had simply been unable to stop. Her Tony had been a victim of that rarest of automobile mishaps, an honest accident. Her shock and depression were increased by guilt. The fates had taken out of her hands the decision on what to do about Tony, and the sick secret part of her was glad it was so, because she hadn't wanted to marry Tony, not since the night of her dream. She wrote down the day before she went home. She was sitting on a rock outcropping by herself, and after an hour or so the tears came. They surprised her with their fury. She cried until her stomach hurt and her head ached, and when the tears passed, she felt not better but at least drained and empty. And that was when Ed Hamner said, "Beth?" She jerked around, her mouth filled with the copper taste of fear, half expecting to see the snarling wolf of her dream. But it was only Ed Hamner, looking sunburned and strangely defenseless without his fatigue jacket and blue jeans. He was wearing red shorts that stopped just ahead of his bony knees, a white t-shirt that billowed on his thin chest like a loose sail in the ocean breeze, and rubber thongs. He wasn't smiling, and the fierce sun glitter on his glasses made it impossible to see his eyes. "Ed?" she said tentatively, half convinced that this was some grief-induced hallucination. "Is that really—" "Yeah, yes, it's me." "How—" "I've been working at the Lakewood Theater in in Sculligan. I ran into your roommate. Alice, is that her name?" "Yes. She told me what happened. I came right away." "Poor Beth." He moved his head, only a degree or so, but the sun glare slid off his glasses, and she saw nothing wolfish, nothing predatory, but only a calm, warm sympathy. She began to weep again, and staggered a little with the unexpected force of it. Then he was holding her, and then it was all right. They had dinner at the Silent Woman in Waterville, which was 25 miles away, maybe exactly the distance she needed. They went in Ed's car, a new Corvette, and he drove well, neither showily nor fussily as she had guessed he might. She didn't want to talk, and she didn't want to be cheered up. He seemed to know it, and played quiet music on the radio. And he ordered without consulting her seafood. She thought she wasn't hungry, but when the food came, she fell to ravenously. When she looked up again, her plate was empty, and she laughed nervously. Ed was smoking a cigarette and watching her. "The grieving damsel ate a hearty meal," she said. "You must think I'm awful." "No," he said. "You've been through a lot, and you need to get your strength back. It's like being sick, isn't it?" "Yes, just like that." He took her hand across the table, squeezed it briefly, then let it go. "But now it's recuperation time, Beth." "Is it? Is it really?" "Yes," he said. "So tell me, what are your plans?" "I'm going home tomorrow. After that, I don't know." "You're going back to school, aren't you?" "I just don't know. After this, it seems so trivial. A lot of the purpose seems to have gone out of it, and all the fun. It'll come back. That's hard for you to believe now, but it's true. Try for 6 weeks and see. You got nothing better to do." The last seemed a question. "That's true, I guess, but could I have a cigarette?" "Sure. They're menthol, though. Sorry." She took one. "How did you know I didn't like menthol cigarettes?" He shrugged. "You just don't look like one of those, I guess." She smiled. "You're funny. Do you know that?" He smiled neutrally. "No, really. For you of all people to turn up. I thought I didn't want to see anyone. But I'm really glad it was you, Ed. Sometimes it's nice to be with someone you're involved with." "That's it, I guess." She paused. "Who are you, Ed? Besides my fairy godfather, who are you really?" It was suddenly important to her that she know. He shrugged. "Nobody much. Just one of the sort of funny-looking guys you see creeping around campus with a load of books under one arm. And you're not funny-looking." "Sure I am," he said, and smiled. Never grew all the way out of my high school acne. Never got rushed by a big frat. Never made any kind of splash in the social world. Just a dorm rat making grades, that's all. When the big corporations interview on campus next spring, I'll probably sign on with one of them, and Ed Hamner will disappear forever. That would be a great shame, she said softly. He smiled, and it was a very peculiar smile, almost bitter. What about your folks? She asked. Where you live, what you like to do another time, he said. I want to get you back. You've got a long plane ride tomorrow and a lot of hassles. Hey, he's got a point there. He's really got a point there. The evening left her relaxed for the first time since Tony's death, without that feeling that somewhere inside a man's spring was being wound and wound to the breaking point. She thought sleep would come easily, but it did not. Little questions nagged. Alice told me. Poor Beth. But Alice was summering in Kittery, 8 miles from Skowhegan. She must have been at Lakewood for a play. The Corvette, this year's model. Expensive. A backstage job at Lakewood hadn't paid for that. Were his parents rich? He had ordered just what she would have ordered herself. Maybe the only thing on the menu she would have eaten enough of to discover was that she was hungry. The menthol cigarettes, the way he had kissed her goodnight, exactly as she wanted to be kissed. And you've got a long plane ride tomorrow. He knew she was going home because she had told him, but how had he known she was going by plane, or that it was a long ride? It bothered her. It bothered her because she was halfway to being in love with Ed Hamner. I know what you need. Like the voice of a submarine captain tolling off farther fathoms, the words he had greeted her with followed her down to sleep. He didn't come to the tiny Augusta airport to see her off, and waiting for the plane, she was surprised by her own disappointment. She was thinking about how quietly you could grow to depend on a person, almost like a junkie with a habit. The high fools himself that he could take this stuff or leave it, when really, Elizabeth Rogan, the PA blared, please pick up the white courtesy phone. She hurried to it, and Ed's voice said, Beth? Ed, it's good to see you. I thought maybe that I'd meet you. He laughed. You don't need me for that. You're a big, strong girl. Beautiful, too. You can handle this. Will I see you at school? I. Yes, I think so. Good. There was a moment of silence. Then he said, Because I love you. I have from the first time I saw you. Her tongue was locked. She couldn't speak. A thousand thoughts whirled through her mind. She laughed again gently. No, don't say anything. No, wait, that's him saying it. Hold on. No, don't say anything. Not now. I'll see you. There'll be time then. All the time in the world. Good trip, Beth. Goodbye. And he was gone, leaving her with a white phone in her hand and her own chaotic thoughts and questions. September. Elizabeth picked up the old pattern of school and classes like a woman who had been interrupted at knitting. She was rooming with Alice again, of course. They had been roomies since freshman year, when they had been thrown together by the housing department computer. They had always gotten along well, despite differing interests and personalities. Alice was the studious one, a chemistry major with a 3.6 average. Elizabeth was more social, less bookish, with a split major in education and math. They still got on well, but a big coolness seemed to have grown up between them over the summer. Elizabeth chalked it up to the difference of opinion over the sociology final and didn't mention it. The events of the summer began to seem dreamlike. It, in a funny way, it sometimes seemed that Tony might have been a boy she had known in high school. It still hurt to think about him, and she avoided the subject with Alice, but the hurt was an old bruised throb and not the bright pain of an open wound. What hurt more was Ed Hamner's failure to call. A week passed, then two, then it was October. She got a student directory from the union and looked up his name. It was no help. After his name were only the words Mill Street, and Mill was a very long street indeed. And so she waited. When she was called for dates, which was often, she turned them down. Alice raised her eyebrows but said nothing. She was buried alive in a 6-week biochem project and spent most of her evenings at the library. Elizabeth noticed the long white envelopes that her roommate was receiving once or twice a week in the mail, since she was usually back from class first, but thought nothing of them. The private detective agency was discreet. It did not print its return address on its envelopes. Hmm. With the way this story is going, it makes me. Now, obviously, there's probably. We all know this is going to be Stephen King, so we know that at some point something crazy is about to happen. We just don't know what it is right now. But with how this is kind of playing out, it made me think of this one video that it was like a manga recap of this one bit involving two characters. How a guy ends up dating this one chick a few times, but then as the story progresses, uh, he starts questioning anything and everything going on with the date, to the point to where he's kind of questioning what's right and what's wrong. But yet they still go on a few dates. But then, sometime later, uh, he sees or hears nothing from this woman, this other character, again. But then he basically goes on a date with another character, and the whole time he is like the shell of his former self, where being the nervous wreck, uh, he was the type that was reassuring the person that he's on this date with, reassuring her that she's not really doing anything wrong. And then it clicks him. Then it clicks in his head. He realizes the reason why she was with him was to help him boost his self confidence, as well as to help other, you well, basically to boost his self confidence, which he ends up doing. His self confidence does get boosted to the point to where he's reassuring this other character, the second character that he's dating, that she's not doing anything wrong, and he's even, for the most part, holding the reins of the date, but not exactly to a T. So yeah. But let's see how this story goes in the world of Stephen King, in the mind of Stephen King. Before we read the story that I really bought this book for in the first place. When the intercom buzzed, Alice was studying. uh, You get it, Liz. Probably for you anyway. Elizabeth went to the intercom. Yes? Gentleman door color, Liz. Oh, Lord. Who is it? She asked, annoyed, and ran through her tattered stack of excuses. Migraine headache. She hadn't used that one this week. The desk girl said, amused. His name is Edward Jackson Hamner Jr., no less. Her voice lowered. His socks don't match. Elizabeth's hand flew to the collar of her robe. Oh, God. Tell him I'll be right down. No, tell him it'll be just a minute. No, a couple of minutes, okay? Sure, the voice said dubiously. Don't have a hemorrhage. Elizabeth took a pair of slacks out of her closet, took out a short denim skirt, felt the curlers in her hair and groaned, began to yank them out. Alice watched all this calmly, without speaking, but she looked speculatively at the door for a long time after Elizabeth had left. He looked just the same. He hadn't changed at all. He was wearing his green fatigue jacket and it still looked at least 2 sizes too big. One of the bows of his horn-rimmed glasses had been mended with electrician's tape. His jeans looked new and stiff, miles from the soft and faded in look that Tony had achieved effortlessly. He was wearing one green sock, one brown sock, and she knew she loved him. Why didn't you call before? She asked, going to him. He stuck his hands in the pockets of his jacket and grinned shyly. I thought I'd give you some time to date around, meet some guys, figure out what you want. I think I know that. Good. Would you like to go to a movie? Anything, she said. Anything at all. As the days passed, it occurred to her that she had never met anyone, male or female, that seemed to understand her moods and needs so completely or so wordlessly. Their tastes coincided. While Tony had enjoyed violent movies of the Godfather type, Ed seemed more into comedy or non-violent dramas. He took her to the circus one night when she was feeling low, and they had a hilariously wonderful time. Study dates were real study dates, not just an excuse to grope on the third floor of the Union. He took her to dances and seemed especially good at the old ones, which she loved. They won a 50s stroll trophy at a homecoming nostalgia dance. More important, he seemed to understand what she wanted to be when she wanted to be passionate. He didn't force her or hurry her. She never got the feeling that she had with some of the other boys she had gone out with, that there was an inner timetable for sex, beginning with a kiss and goodnight on date one, and ending with a night in some friend's borrowed apartment on date 10. The Mill Street apartment was Ed's exclusively, a third floor walk up. They went there often, and Elizabeth went without the feeling that she was walking into some minor league. Don Juan's passion pit. He didn't push. He honestly seemed to want what she wanted, when she wanted it, and things progressed. When school reconvened following the semester break, Alice seemed strangely preoccupied. Several times that afternoon before Ed came to pick her up, they were going out to dinner. Elizabeth looked up to see her roommate frowning down at a large manila envelope on her desk. Once Elizabeth almost asked about it, then decided not to. Some new project, probably. It was snowing hard when Ed brought her back to the dorm. Tomorrow. Tomorrow? He said. My place? Sure, I'll make some popcorn. Great, he said and kissed her. I love you, Beth. Love you too. Would you like to stay over? Ed asked evenly. Tomorrow night? All right, Ed. She looked into his eyes. Whatever you want. Good, he said quietly. Sleep well, kid. You too. Hello, Lincoln Crosso. How you doing tonight? She expected that Alice would be asleep and entered the room quietly, but Alice was up and sitting at her desk. Alice, are you okay? I have to talk to you, Liz. About Ed. What about him? Alice said carefully. I think that when I'm finished talking to you, we're not going to be friends anymore. For me, that's giving up a lot, so I want you to listen carefully. Then maybe you better not say anything. I have to try. Elizabeth felt her initial curiosity kindle into anger. Have you been snooping around Ed? Alice only looked at her. Were you jealous of us? No. If I'd been jealous of you and your dates, I would have moved out 2 years ago. Hmm. That's actually a good point. Because, I mean, usually if you're jealous of somebody because of certain things, or, like, of someone or someone that, or the someone else someone else that you're not really jealous of, yeah, you probably would want to try to get away from that as soon as possible. So yeah, Elizabeth looked at her, perplexed. She knew what Alice said was the truth, and she suddenly felt afraid. Two things made me wonder about Hamner, Alice said. First, you wrote me about Tony's death and how lucky it was that I'd seen Ed at the Lakewood Theater. How he came right out over to Booth Bay and really helped you out. But I never saw him, Liz. I was never near the Lakewood Theater last summer. But how did you know Tony was dead? I have no idea. I only know he didn't get it from me. The other thing was that AD eidetic memory business. My God, Liz, he can't even remember which socks he's got on. That's a different thing altogether, Liz said stiffly. Ed Hamner was in Las Vegas last summer, Alice said softly. He came back in mid-July and took a motel room in Permaquid. That's just across the Boothbay Harbor downtown line. Almost as if he were waiting for you to meet him. That's crazy! And how would you know Ed was in Las Vegas? I ran into Shirley D'Antonio just before school started. She worked in the Pines restaurant, which is just across from the Playhouse. She said she never saw anybody who looked like Ed Hamner, so I've known he's been lying to you about several things. And so I went to my father and laid it out, and he gave me the go-ahead. To do what? Elizabeth asked, bewildered. To hire a private detective agency. Elizabeth was on her feet. No more, Alice. That's it. She would catch the bus into town, spend tonight in Ed's apartment. She had only been waiting for him to ask her anyway. At least no, Alice said. Then make your own decision. I don't have to know anything except he's kind and good and love is blind, huh? Alice said and smiled bitterly. Well, maybe I happen to love you a little, Liz. Have you ever thought of that? Elizabeth turned and looked at her for a long moment. If you do, you've got a funny way of showing it, she said. Go on then. Maybe you're right. Maybe I owe you that much. Go on. You knew him a long time ago, Alice said quietly. I. What? P.S. 119 Bridgeport, Connecticut. Elizabeth was struck dumb. She and her parents had lived in Bridgeport for 6 years, moving to their present home in the year after she had finished the second grade. She had gone to PS 119, but Alice, are you sure? Do you remember him? No, of course not. But she did remember that feeling she'd had the first time she had seen Ed, the feeling of deja vu. The pretty ones never remember the ugly ducklings, I guess. Maybe he had a crush on you. You were in the first grade with him, Liz. Maybe he sat in the back of the room and just watched you. Or on the playground. Just a little nothing kid who had already wore glasses and probably braces and you couldn't even remember him. But I'll bet he remembers you, Elizabeth said. What else? The agency traced him from school fingerprints. After that, it was just a matter of finding people and talking to them. The operative assigned to the case said he couldn't understand some of what he was getting. Neither do I. Some of it's scary. It better be, Elizabeth said grimly. Ed Hamler Sr. was a compulsive gambler. He worked for a top-line advertising agency in New York and then moved to Bridgeport, sort of on the run. The operative says that almost every big money poker game and high-priced book in the city was holding his markers. Elizabeth closed her eyes. These people really saw you got a full measure of dirt for your dollar, didn't they? Maybe. Anyway, Ed's father got another jam in Bridgeport. It was gambling again, but this time he got mixed up with a big-time loan shark. He got a broken leg and a broken arm somehow. The operative says he doubts it was an accident. Anything else? Elizabeth asked. Child beating? Embezzlement? He landed a job at the two-bit Los Angeles ad agency in 1961. That was a little too close in Las Vegas. He started to spend his weekends there, gambling heavily and losing. Then he started taking Ed Jr. with him, and he started to win. You're making all of this up. You must be. Alice tapped the report in front of her. It's all here, Liz. Some of it wouldn't stand up in court, but the operative says none of the people he talked with would have a reason to lie. Ed's father called Ed his good luck charm. At first, nobody objected to the boy, even though it was illegal for him to be in the casinos. His father was a prize fish, but then the father started sticking this to roulette, playing only odd, even, and red black. By the end of the year, the boy was off limits in every casino on the strip, and his father took up a new kind of gambling. What? The stock market. When the Hamlers moved to LA in the middle of 1961, they were living in the $90 a month cheese box, and Mr. Hamler was driving a 52 Chevrolet. At the end of 1962, just 16 months later, he had quit his job and they were living in their own home in San Jose. Mr. Hamler was driving a brand new Thunderbird and Mrs. Hamler had a Volkswagen. You see, it's against the law for a small boy to be in the Nevada casinos, but no one could take the stock market page away from him. Are you implying that he could... Alice, you're crazy. I'm not implying anything. Unless maybe just that he knew what his daddy needed. I know what you need. It was almost as if the words had been spoken into her ear, and she shuddered. Mrs. Handler spent the next 6 years in and out of the various mental institutions, supposedly for nervous disorders, but the operative talked to an orderly who said she was pretty close to psychotic. She claimed her son was the devil's henchman. She stabbed him with a pair of scissors in 1964. Tried to kill him. She... Liz? Liz, what is it? The scar, she muttered. We were swimming at the university pool on an open night about a month ago. He's got a deep dimpled scar in his shoulder. Here. She put her hand just above her left breast. He said, a wave of nausea tried to climb up her throat, and she had to wait for it to recede before she could go on. He said he fell on a picket fence when he was a little boy. Shall I go on? Finish, why not? What can it hurt now? His mother was released from a very plush mental institution in the San Joaquin Valley in 1968. The three of them went on a vacation. They stopped a picnic spot on Route 101. The boy was collecting firewood when she drove the car right over the edge of the drop-off above the ocean with both her and her husband in it. It might have been an attempt to run Ed down. By then he was nearly 18. His father left him $1 million stock portfolio. Ed came east a year and a half later and enrolled here. And that's the end. No more skeletons in the closet? Liz, aren't there enough? She got up. She, no wonder he never wants to mention his family. But you had to dig up the corpse, didn't you? You're blind, Alice said. Elizabeth was putting on her coat. I suppose you're going to him? Right. Because you love him. Right. Alice crossed the room and grabbed her arm. Will you get that sulky, petulant look off your face for a second and think? Ed Hamner is able to do things the rest of us only dream about. He got his father a stake at roulette and made him rich playing the stock market. He seems to be able to will winning. Maybe he's some kind of low-grade psychic. Maybe he's got precognition. I don't know. There are people who seem to have a dose of that. Liz, hasn't it ever occurred to you that he's forced you to love him? Liz turned to her slowly. I've never heard anything so ridiculous in my life. Is it? He gave me that sociology test the same way he gave his father the right side of the roulette board. He was never enrolled in any sociology course. I checked. He did it because it was the only way he could make you take him seriously. Stop it! Liz cried. She cocked her hands over her ears. He knew the test, and he knew when Tony was killed, and he knew you were going home on a plane. He even knew just the right psychological moment to step back into your life last October. Elizabeth pulled away from her and opened the door. Please, Alice said. Please, Liz, listen. I don't know how he can do those things. I doubt if even he knows for sure. He might not mean to do you any harm, but he already is. He made you love him by knowing everything, every secret thing you want and need, and that's not love at all. That's rape. Elizabeth slammed the door and ran down the stairs. Damn, that's deep. She caught the last bus of the evening into town. It was snowing more heavily than ever, and the bus lumbered through the drifts that had blown across the road like a crippled beetle. Elizabeth sat in the back, one of the only 6 or 7 passengers, 1,000 thoughts in her mind. Menthol cigarettes, the stock exchange, the way he had known her mother's nickname was Dee Dee, a little boy sitting at the back of a first-grade classroom, making sheep's eyes at a vivacious little girl too young to understand that. I know what you need. No, no, I do love him. Did she? Or was she simply delighted at being with someone who always ordered the right thing, took her to the right movie, and did not want to go anywhere or do anything she didn't? Was he just a kind of psychic mirror, showing her only what she wanted to see? The presents he gave her were always the right presents. When the weather had turned suddenly cold and she had been longing for a hairdryer, who gave her one? Ed Hamner, of course. Just happened to see one on sale in Days, he had said. She, of course, had been delighted. That's not love at all. That's rape. The wind clawed at her face as she stepped out onto the corner of Main and Mill, and she winced against it as the bus drew away with a smooth diesel growl. Its tail lights twinkled briefly in the snowy night for a moment and were gone. She had never felt so lonely in her life. He wasn't home. She stood outside his door after 5 minutes of knocking, nonplussed. It occurred to her that she had no idea what Ed did or whom he saw when he wasn't with her. The subject had never come up. Maybe he's raising the price of another hairdryer in a poker game. With sudden decision, she stood on her toes and felt along the top of the door jamb for the spare key she knew he kept there. Her fingers stumbled over it and it fell to the hall floor with a clink. She picked it up and used it in the lock. The apartment looked different with Ed gone. Artificial, like a stage set. It had often amused her that someone who cared so little about his personal appearance should have such a neat picture book domicile, almost as if he had decorated it for her and not himself. But of course that was crazy, wasn't it? It occurred to her again, as if for the first time, how much she liked the chair she sat in when they studied or watched TV. It was just right, the way Baby Bear's chair had been for Goldilocks. Not too hard, not too soft. Just right. Like everything else she associated with Ed. There were two doors opening off the living room. One went to the kitchenette, the other to his bedroom. The wind whistled outside, making the old apartment building creak and settle. In the bedroom, she stared at the brass bed. It looked neither too hard nor too soft, but just right. An insidious voice smirked. It's almost too perfect, isn't it? She went to the bookcase and ran her eye aimlessly over the titles. One jumped at her eyes and she pulled it out. Dance Crazes of the 50s. I need to mute my TV because if I don't, it is going to play some music. She One jumped at her eye and she pulled it out. Dance Crazes of the 50s. The book opened cleanly to a point of some 3/4 through. A section titled "The Scroll" had been circled heavily in red grease pencil, and in the margin the word "Beth" had been written in large, almost accusatory letters. I ought to go now, she told herself. I can still save something. If he came back now, I could never look him in the face again, and Alice would win. Then she'd really get her money's worth. But she couldn't stop and knew it. Things had gone too far. She went to the closet and turned the knob, but it didn't give. Locked. On the off chance she stood on tiptoe again and felt along the top of the door, and her fingers felt the key. She took it down, and somewhere inside a voice said very clearly, "Don't do this." She thought of Bluebeard's wife and what she found when she opened the wrong door, but it was indeed too late. If she didn't proceed now, she would have always wondered. She opened the closet. You guys ready to hear what's in the closet? And had the strangest feeling that this was where the real Ed Hamner Jr. had been hiding all the time. The closet was a mess, a jumbled rickrack of clothes, books, an unstrung tennis racket, a pair of tattered tennis shoes, old prelims and reports tossed helter-skelter, a spilled pouch of Burkham Brick pipe tobacco. His green fatigue jacket had been flung in the far corner. She picked up one of the books and blinked at the title. The Golden Bow. Another. Ancient Rites. Modern Mysteries. Another. Haitian Voodoo. And a last one, bound in old cracked leather. The title almost rubbed off the binding by much handling, smelling vaguely like rotted fish. Necronomicon. She opened it at random, gasped, and flung it away, the obscenity still hanging before her eyes. More to retain her composure than anything else, she reached for the green fatigue jacket, not admitting to herself that she meant to go through its pockets. But as she lifted it, she saw something else, a small tin box. Curiously, she picked it up and turned it over in her hands, hearing things rattle inside. It was the kind of box a young boy might choose to keep his treasures in. Stamped in raised letters on the tin bottom were the words Bridgeport Candy Company. She opened it. The doll was on top, the Elizabeth doll. She looked at it and it began to shudder. The doll was dressed in a scrap of red nylon, part of a scarf she had lost 2 or 3 months back at a movie with Ed. The arms were pipe cleaners that had been draped in stuff that looked like blue moss. Graveyard moss, perhaps. There was hair on the doll's head, but that was wrong. It was fine white flax, taped to the doll's pink gum eraser head. Her own hair was sandy blood and coarser than this. This was more than this was more the way her hair had been when she was a little girl. She swallowed and there was a clicking in her throat. Hadn't they all been issued scissors in the first grade? Tiny scissors with rounded blades, just right for a child's hand? Had that long ago little boy crept up behind her, perhaps at nap time, and Elizabeth put the doll aside and looked in the box again. There was a blue poker chip with a strange six-sided pattern drawn on it in red ink. A tattered newspaper obituary. Mr. and Mrs. Edward Hamner. The two of them smiled meaninglessly out of the accompanying photo, and she saw that the same six-sided pattern had been drawn across their faces, this time in black ink like a pal. Two more dolls, one male, one female. The similarity to the faces in the obituary photograph was hideous, unmistakable, and something else. She fumbled it out and her fingers shook so badly she almost dropped it. A tiny sound escaped her. It was a model car, the sort small boys buy in drugstores and hobby shops and then assemble with an airplane do. This one was a Fiat. It had been painted red, and a piece of it looked like one of Tony's shirts had been taped to the front. She turned the model car upside down. Someone had hammered the underside to fragments. So you found it, you ungrateful bitch. She screamed and dropped the car in the box. His foul treasure sprayed across the floor. He was standing in the doorway, looking at her. She had never seen such a look of hate on a human face. She said, "You killed Tony." He grinned unpleasantly. "Do you think you could prove it?" "It doesn't matter," she said, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. "I know, and I never want to see you again. Ever. And if you do anything to anyone else I'll know, and I'll fix you. Somehow." His face twisted. "That's the thanks I get. I gave you everything you ever wanted. Things no man could have. Admit it. I made you perfectly happy." I gotta scream this next line. So I'm gonna be yelling this next line. So volume warning. "You killed Tony!" She screamed it at him. He took another step into the room. "Yes, and I did it for you. And what are you, Beth? You don't know what love is. I loved you from the first time I saw you, over 17 years ago. Could Tony say that? It's never been hard for you. You're pretty. You never had to think about wanting or needing or about being lonely. You never had to find other ways to get the things you had to have. There was always a Tony to give them to you. All you ever had to do was smile and say please. His voice rose a note. I could never get what I wanted that way. Don't you think I tried? It didn't work with my father. He just wanted more and more. He never even kissed me goodnight or gave me a hug until I made him rich. And my mother was the same way. I gave her her marriage back. But what but was that enough for her? She hated me. She wouldn't come near me. She said I was unnatural. I gave her nice things, but that don't do that. Don't. Don't. She stepped on the Elizabeth doll and crushed it, turning her heel on it. Something inside her flared in agony and then was gone. She wasn't afraid of him now. He was just a small, shrunken boy in a young man's body, and his socks didn't match. I don't think you can do anything wrong to. I don't think you can do anything to me now, Ed. She told him. Not now. Am I wrong? He turned from her. Go on, he said weakly. Get out. But I'll leave my box. At least do that. I'll leave the box, but not the things in it. She walked past him. His shoulders twitched as if he might turn and try to grab her, but then they slumped. As she reached the second floor landing, he came to the top of the stairs and called shrilly after her. Go on then! But you'll never be satisfied with any man after me. And when you looks go and men stop trying to give you anything that you want, you'll wish for me. You'll think of what you threw away. She went down the stairs and out into the snow. Its coldness felt good against her face. It was a 2 mile walk to the campus, but she didn't care. She wanted the walk, wanted the cold. She wanted it to make her clean. In a queer, twisted way, in this case, I gotta keep saying this every time so people don't get the wrong idea. Weird, or in this case, queer means weird in this situation. Again, as I've always said, if people don't believe me, they can always Google the old definition of the word queer, and it will say that. It will basically say so. Anyway, in a queer, twisted way, she felt sorry for him. A little boy with a huge power crammed inside a dwarfed spirit. A little boy who tried to make humans behave like toy soldiers and then stamped on them in a fit of temper when they wouldn't or when they found out. And what was she? Blessed with all the things he was not, through no fault of his or effort of her own? She remembered the way she had reacted to Alice, trying blindly and jealously to hold on to something that was easy rather than good. Not caring. Not caring. When you looks go and men stop trying to give you anything you want, you'll wish for me. I know what you need. But she was so small that she actually needed so little. Please, dear God, no. On the bridge between the campus and town, she paused and threw Ed Hamner's scraps of magic over the side, piece by piece. The red painted model Fiat went last, falling end over end into the driven snow until it was lost from sight. Then she walked on. Alright, so we're about, let's see, it's at 73 minutes and we just finished the first story. Alright, we're finally finishing up this story, so let's do this. Now, tomorrow, now I don't know when we'll watch the movie that Children of the Corn, which is what I'll be reading next. I don't know when we'll do that, just for the record, but we will do so, even if it's after I read this next bit of The Hobbit, the next part of reading that book. Even if it's after that, or even after we finish this book, I will still be sure to do it because I said I was going to do it. Without further ado, Children of the Corn. Bert turned the radio on too loud and didn't turn it down because they were on the verge of another argument, and he didn't want it to happen. He was desperate for it not to happen. Vicky said something. What? He shouted. Turn it down! Do you want to break my eardrums? He bit down hard on what might have come through his mouth and turned it down. Vicky was fanning herself with her scarf even though the T-bird was air conditioned. Where are we anyway? Nebraska. She gave him a cold, neutral look. Yes, Bert, I know we're in Nebraska, Bert. But where the hell are we? You got the road atlas. Look it up. Or can't you read? Such wit. This is why we got off the turnpike, so we could look at 300 miles of corn and enjoy the wit and wisdom of Bert Robeson. He was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He decided he was holding it that tightly because if he loosened up, why, one of those hands might just fly off and hit the ex-prom queen beside him right in the chops. We're saving our marriage, he told himself. Yes, we're doing it the same way us grunts went about saving villages in the war. Vicky, he said carefully, I have driven 1,500 miles on turnpike since we left Boston. I did all that driving myself because you refused to drive. Then I did not refuse, Vicky said hotly. Just because I get migraines when I drive for a long time. And when I asked you if you would navigate for me on some of the secondary roads, you said, sure, Bert. Those were your exact words. Sure, Bert. Then sometimes I wonder I ever wound up married to you. By saying two little words, she stared at him for a moment, white-lipped, and then picked up the road atlas. She turned the pages savagely. It had been a mistake leaving the turnpike, Bert thought morosely. It was a shame, too, because up until then, they had been doing pretty well, treating each other almost like human beings. It had sometimes seemed that this trip to the coast, ostensibly to see Vicky's brother and his wife, but actually had a last-ditch attempt to patch up their own marriage, was going to work. But since they left the pike, it had been bad again. How bad? Well, terrible, actually. We left the turnpike at Hamburg, right? Right. There's nothing more until Gotland, she said. 20 miles. Wide place in the road. Do you suppose we could stop there and get something to eat? Or does your almighty schedule say we have to go until 2 o'clock like we did yesterday? He took his eyes off the road to look at her. I've about had it, Vicky. As far as I'm concerned, we can turn around right here and go home and see that lawyer you wanted to talk to. Because this isn't working that... She had faced forward again, her expression stonily set. It suddenly turned to surprise and fear. Bert, look out! You're going to... He turned his attention back to the road just in time to see something vanish under the T-Bird's bumper. A moment later, while he was only beginning to switch from gas to brake, he felt something thump sickeningly under the front and then the back wheels. They were thrown forward as the car braked along the center line, decelerating from 50 to 0 along black skid marks. A dog, he said. Please tell me it was a dog, Vicky. Her face was pallid cottage cheese color. A boy. A little boy. He just ran out of the corn and... Congratulations, Tiger. She fumbled the car door open, leaned out, threw up. Bert sat straight behind the T-Bird's wheel, hands still gripping it loosely. He was aware of nothing for a long time but the rich, dark smell of fertilizer. Then he saw that Vicky was gone, and when he looked in the outside mirror, he saw her stumbling clumsily back toward a heaped bundle that looked like a pile of rags. She was ordinarily a graceful woman, but now her grace was gone, robbed. It's manslaughter. That's what they call it. I took my eyes off the road. He turned the ignition off and got out. The wind rustled softly through the growing man-high corn, making a weird sound like respiration. Vicky was standing over the bundle of rags now, and he could hear her sobbing. He was halfway between the car and when she stood, and something caught his eye on the left. A gaudy splash of red amid all the green, as bright as barn paint. He stopped, looking directly into the corn. He found himself thinking, anything to untrack from those rags that were not rags, that it must have been a fantastically good growing season for corn. It grew close together, almost ready to bear. You could plunge into those neat shaded rows and spend a day trying to find your way out again. But the neatness was broken here. Several tall corn stalks had been broken and leaned askew, and what was that further back in the shadows? Bert! Vicky screamed at him. Don't you want to come see? See if you can tell all your poker buddies what you bagged in Nebraska? Don't you? But the rest of it was lost in fresh sobs. Her shadow was puddled starkly around her feet. It was almost noon. Shade closed over him as he entered the corn. The red barn paint was blood. There was a low, somnolent buzz as flies lit, tasted and buzzed off again, maybe to tell others. There was more blood on the leaves further in. Surely it couldn't have splattered this far. And then he was standing over the object he had seized from the road. He picked it up. The neatness of the rows was disturbed here. Several stalks were planted drunkenly. Two of them had been broken clean off. The earth had been gouged. There was blood. The corn rustled. With a little shiver he walked back to the road. Vicky was having hysterics, screaming unintelligible words at him, crying, laughing. Who would have thought it could end in such a melodramatic way? He looked at her and saw he wasn't having an identity crisis, or a difficult life transition, or any of those trendy things. He hated her. He gave her a hard slap in the face. She stopped short and put a hand against the reddening impression of his fingers. You'll go to jail, Bert, she said sullenly. I don't think so, he said, and put the suitcase he had found in the corner at her feet. What? I don't know. I guess it belonged to him. He pointed to the sprawled, face-down body that lay in the road. No more than 13 from the look of him. The suitcase was old. The brown leather was battered and scuffled. Two banks, two hanks of clothesline had been wrapped around it and tied in large, clownish grannies. Vicky bent to undo one of them, saw the blood greased into the knot, and withdrew. Bert knelt and turned the body over gently. I don't want to look, Vicky said, staring down helplessly anyway. And when the staring, sightless face flopped up to regard them, she screamed again. The boy's face was dirty, his expression a grimace of terror. His throat had been cut. Bert got up and put his arms around Vicky as she began to sway. Don't faint, he said very quietly. Do you hear me, Vicky? Don't faint. He repeated it over and over, and at last she began to recover and held him tight. There might have been there might have been dancing there on the noon-struck road with the boy's corpse at their feet. Vicky? What? Muffled against his shirt. Go back to the car and put the keys in your pocket. Get the blanket out of the back seat and my rifle. Bring them here. The rifle? Someone cut his throat. Maybe whoever is watching us. Her head jerked up and her wide eyes considered the corn. It marched away as far as the eye could see, undulating up and down small dips and rises of land. I imagine he's gone, but why take chances? Go on, do it. She watched stiltedly She walked stiltedly back to the car, her shadow following the dark mascot who stuck close at this hour of the day. When she leaned into the back seat, Bert squatted beside the boy. White male, no distinguishing marks. Run over, yes, but the T-bird hadn't cut the kid's throat. It had been cut raggedly and inefficiently. No army sergeant had shown the killer the finer points of hand-to-hand assassination, but the final effect had been deadly. He had either run or been pushed through the last 30 feet of corn, dead or mortally wounded, and Bert Robeson had run him down. If the boy had still been alive when the car hit him, his life had been cut short by 30 seconds at most. Vicky tapped him on the shoulder and he jumped. She was standing with the brown army blanket over her left arm, the cased pump shotgun in her right hand, her face averted. He took the blanket and spread it on the road. He rolled the body onto it. Vicky uttered a desperate little moan. You okay? He looked up at her. Vicky? Okay, she said in a strangled voice. He flipped the sides of the blanket over the body and scooped it up, hating the thick, dead weight of it. It tried to make a U in his arms and slithered through his grasp. He clutched it tighter and then walked back to the T-bird. Open the trunk, he grunted. The trunk was full of travel stuff, suitcases and souvenirs. Vicky shifted most of it into the back seat, and Bert slipped the body into the maid space and slammed the trunk lid down. A sigh of relief escaped him. Vicky was standing by the driver's side door, still holding the cased rifle. Just put it in the back and get in. He looked at his watch and saw only 15 minutes had passed. It seemed like hours. What about the suitcase? She asked. He trotted back down the road to where it stood on the white line, like the focal point in an impressionist painting. He picked it up by its tattered handle and paused for a moment. He had a strong sensation of being watched. There was a feeling he had read about in books, mostly cheap fiction, and he had always doubted its reality. Now he didn't. It was as if there were people in the corn, maybe a lot of them, coldly estimating whether the woman could get the gun out of the case and use it before they could grab him, drag him, drag him into the shady groves, cut his throat. Heart beating, heart beating thickly, he ran back to the car, pulled the keys out of the trunk lock, and got in. Vicky was crying again. Bert got them moving, and before a minute had passed, he could no longer pick out the spot where it had happened in the rearview mirror. What did you say the next town was? He asked. Oh, she bent over the road atlas again. Scotland. We should be there in 10 minutes. Does it look big enough to have a police station? No, it's just a dot. Hmm. Maybe there's a constable. They drove in silence for a while. They passed a silo on the left. Nothing else but corn. Nothing past them going the other way, not even a farm truck. Have we passed anything since we got off the turnpike, Vicky? She thought about it. A car and a tractor at that intersection. No, since we've gone on this road, Route 17. No, I don't think we have. Earlier this might have been the preface to some cutting remark. Now she only stared out of her half of the windshield at the unrolling road and the endless dotted line. Vicky, could you open the suitcase? Do you think it might matter? Don't know, it might. While she picked at the knots, her face was set in a peculiar way, expressionless but tight-mouthed, that Bert remembered his mother wearing when she pulled the innards out of a Sunday chicken. Bert turned on the radio again. The pop station they had been listening to was almost obliterated in static, and Bert switched, running the red marker slowly down the dial. Farm reports, Buck Owens, Timmy Wynette, all distant, nearly distorted into babble. Then, near the end of the dial, one single word blurted out of the speaker, so loud and clear that the lips which uttered it might have been directly beneath the grill of the dashboard speaker. Atonement! This voice bellowed. Bert made a surprised grunting sound. Vicky jumped. Only by the blood of the Lamb are we saved! The blood roared, and Bert hurriedly turned the sound down. This station was close, all right. So close that, yes, there it was. Poking out of the corn at the horizon, a spidery red tripod against the blue. The radio tower. Atonement is the word, brothers and sisters, the voice told them, dropping to a more conversational pitch. In the background, off mic, voices murmured amen. There's some things it's okay to get in the world. So if you can work and walk in the world without being submerged by the word, now is that what the word of God teaches us? Off mic but still loud. No! Holy Jesus! The evangelist shouted, and now the words came in a powerful pumping cadence, almost as compelling as a driving rock and roll beat. When they gonna know that way is death? When they gonna know that the wages of the world are paid on the other side? Huh? Huh? The Lord has said there's many mansions in his house, but there's no room for the fornicator, no room for the coveter, no room for the defiler of the corn, no room for the homosexual, no room. Vicky snapped it off. That triple makes me sick. What did he say? Bert asked her. What did he say about corn? I didn't hear it. She was picking at the second clothesline knot. He said something about corn. I know he did. I got it, Vicky said, and the suitcase fell open in her lap. They were passing a sign that read, Scotland, 5 miles. Drive carefully, protect our children. The sign had been put up by the Elks. There were 22 bullet holes in it. Socks, Vicky said. 2 pairs of pants, a shirt, a belt, a strong tie with it. She held it up, showing him the killing gilt neck clasp. Who's that? Bert glanced at it. Hopalong Cassidy, I think. Oh, she put it back. She was crying again. After a moment, Bert said, Did anything strike you funny about that radio sermon? No. I heard enough of that stuff as a kid to last me forever. I told you about it. Didn't you think he sounded kind of young, that preacher? She uttered a mirthless laugh. A teenager, maybe. So what? That's what's so monstrous about that whole trip. They like to get hold of themselves when their minds are still rubber. Still rubber. They know how to put all the emotional checks and balances in. You should have been at some of the tent meetings my mother and father dragged me to. Some of the ones I was saved at. Let's see, there was Baby Hortons, the singing marvel. She was 8. She'd come on and sing Leaning on the Everlasting Arms while her daddy passed the plate, telling everyone to dig deep now, let's not let this little child of God down. Then there was Norman Staunton. He used to preach hellfire and brimstone in those little Lord Fauntleroy suit with the short pants. He was only 7. She nodded at his look of unbelief. They weren't the only 2 either. There were plenty of them on the circuit. They were good draws. She spat the word. Ruby Damp now. She was a 10-year-old faith healer, the Bree sisters. They used to come out with little tinfoil halos over their heads and... Oh! What is it? He jerked around to look at her, and what she was holding in her hands. Vicky was staring at it rapidly. Her slowly signing hands had snagged it on the bottom of the suitcase and brought it up as she talked. Bert pulled over to take a better look. She gave it to him wordlessly. It was a crucifix that had been made from twists of corn husk, one stream now dry. Attached to this by woven corn silk was a dwarf corn cob. Most of the kernels had been carefully removed, probably dug out one at a time with a pocket knife. Those kernels remaining formed a crude crucifixion figure in yellowish bas relief. Corn kernel eyes, each slit long ways to suggest pupils. Outstretched kernel arms, the legs together, terminating in a rough indication of bare feet. Above four letters also raised from the bone white cob. INRI. Hmm. That's a fantastic piece of workmanship, he said. It's hideous, she said in a flat, strained voice. Throw it out. Vicky, the police might want to see it. Why? Well, I don't know why. Maybe. Throw it out. Will you please do that for me? I don't want it in the car. I'll put it in back, and as soon as we see the cops, we'll get rid of it one way or the other. I promise. Okay? Oh, do whatever you want with it, she shouted at him. You will anyway. Troubled, he threw the thing in back where it landed on a pile of clothes. Its corn kernel eyes stared rapidly at the T-bird's dull light. He pulled out again, gravel splurting from beneath the trees. We'll give the body and everything that was in the suitcase to the cops, he promised. Then we'll be shut of it. Vicky didn't answer. She looked at her hands. A mile further on, the endless cornfields drew away from the road, showing farmhouses and outbuildings. In one yard they saw dirty chickens pecking listlessly at the soil. There were faded cola and chewing tobacco ads on the roofs of barns. They passed a tall billboard that said, Only Jesus Saves. They passed a cafe with a conical gas island, but Bert decided to get on into the center of town. If there was one, if there was one. If not, they could come back to the cafe. It only occurred to him after they had passed it that the parking lot had been empty except for a dirty old pickup truck that had looked like it was sitting on two flat tires. Vicky suddenly began to laugh, a high, giggling sound that struck Bert as being dangerously close to hysteria. What's so funny? The signs, she said, gasping and hiccuping. Haven't you been reading them? When they called us the Bible Belt, they weren't kidding. Oh, Lordy, there's another bunch. Another burst of hysterical laughter escaped her, and she clapped both hands over her mouth. Each sign had only one word. They were leaning on whitewashed sticks that had been implanted in the sandy shoulder, long ago by the looks. The whitewash was flaked and faded. They were coming up at 80-foot intervals, and Bert read, a cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. He only forgot one thing, Griffey said, still giggling helplessly. What? Bert asked, frowning. Burma shave. She had a knuckled fist against her open mouth to keep in the laughter, but her semi-hysterical giggles flowed around it like effervescent ginger ale bubbles. Vicky, are you all right? I will be, just as soon as we're 1,000 miles away from here. It's sunny, sinful California with the Rockies between us and Nebraska. Another group of signs came up and they read them silently. Take this and eat, saith the Lord God. Now why, Bert thought, should I immediately associate that indefinite pronoun with corn? Isn't that what they say when they give you communion? It had been so long. Hello, Stephen. How you doing tonight? It had been so long since he had been to church that he really couldn't remember. He wouldn't be surprised if they used cornbread for holy water around these parts. He opened his mouth to tell Vicky that, and then thought better of it. They breasted a gentle rise, and there was a Gatlin below them, all 3 blocks of it, looking like a set from a movie about the Depression. There'll be a constable, Bert said, and wondered why the sight of that hick, one timetable town dozing in the sun should have brought a lump of dread into his throat. They passed a speed sign proclaiming that no more than 30 was now in order, and another sign, rust-flecked, which said, "You are now entering Gatlin, nicest little town in Nebraska, or anywhere else. Population 5,431. Dusty elms stood on both sides of the road, most of them diseased. They passed the Gatlin lumber yard and the 76 gas station, where the price sign swung slowly in a hot noon breeze. Regular 35.9, high test 38.9, and another which said, "High truckers diesel fuel around back." Hmm. They crossed Elm Street, then Birch Street, and came up on the town square. The houses lining the streets were plain wood with screened porches, angular and functional. The lawns were yellow and dispirited. Up ahead, a mongrel dog walked slowly out into the middle of Maple Street, stood looking at them for a moment, and lay down in the road with its nose on its paws. Hmm. Could you guys blame me for thinking of Freddy Krueger with the Elm Street and Cujo for the mongrel dog bit? Those bits there? Stop, Biffy said. Stop right here. Bert pulled obediently to the curb. Turn around. Let's take the body to Grand Island. It's not too far, is it? Let's do that. Vicky, what's wrong? What do you mean, what's wrong? She asked, her voice rising thinly. This town is empty, Bert. There's nobody here but us. Can't you feel that? He had felt something and still felt it, but it just seems that way, he said. But it sure is a one-hydrant town. Probably all up in the square having a bake sale or a bingo game. There's no one here, she said, the words with a queer, strained emphasis. Again, gotta say it again, queer is another word for weird in this situation. Gotta point that out before some random person gets offended, as we all know how the internet be sometimes. Anyway, didn't you see that 76 station back there? Sure, by the lumberyard. By the lumberyard. So what? His mind was elsewhere, listening to the dull buzz of a cicada burrowing into one of the nearby elms. He could smell corn, dusty roses, and fertilizer, of course. For the first time, they were off the turnpike and in a town in a state he had never been in before, although he had flown over it from time to time in United Airlines 747s. And somehow it felt all wrong but all right. Somewhere up ahead there would be a drugstore with a soda fountain, a movie house named the Bijou, a school named after JFK. Bert, the prices said 35.9 for regular and 38.9 for high octane. Now, how long has it been since anyone in this country paid those prices? At least 4 years, he admitted. But Vicky, we're right in town, Bert, and there's not a car. Not one car. Grand Island is 70 miles away. It would look funny if we took him there. I don't care. Look, let's just drive up to the courthouse and no! There, damn it, there. Why our marriage is falling apart in a nutshell. No, I won't. No, sir. And furthermore, I'll hold my breath till I turn blue if you don't let me have my way. Vicky, he said. I want to get out of here, Bert. Vicky, listen to me. Turn around. Let's go. Vicky, will you stop for a minute? I'll stop when we're driving the other way now. Let's go. We have a dead child in the trunk of our car. He roared at her and took a distinct pleasure at the way she flinched, the way her face crumbled. In a slightly lower voice, he went on. His throat was cut and he was shoved down into the road, and I ran him over. Now I'm going to drive up to the courthouse or whatever they have here, and I'm going to report it. If you want to start walking back toward the pike, go to it. I'll pick you up. But don't you tell me to turn around and drive 70 miles to Grand Island like we had nothing in the trunk but a bag of garbage. He happens to be some mother's son, and I'm going to report it before whoever killed him gets over the hills and far away. You bastard, she said, crying. What am I doing with you? I don't know, he said. I don't know anymore. But the situation can be remedied, Vicky. He pulled away from the curb. The dog lifted its head at the brief squeal of the tires and then lowered it to its paws again. They drove the remaining block to the square. At the corner of Main and Pleasant, Main Street split in two. There actually was a town square, a grassy park with a handstand in the middle. On the other end, where Main Street became one again, there were two official-looking buildings. Bert could make out the lettering on one, Batman Municipal Center. That's it, he said. Vicky said nothing. Halfway up the square, Bert pulled over again. They were beside a lunchroom, the Batman Bar and Grill. Where are you going? Vicky asked with alarm as he opened his door. To find out where everyone is. Sign in the window there says open. You're not going to leave me here alone. So come. Who's stopping you? He's got a point there. She unlocked her door and stepped out as he crossed in front of the car. He saw how pale her face was and felt an instant of pity. Hopeless pity. Do you hear it? She asked as he joined her. Hear what? The nothing. No cars, no people, no tractors, nothing. And then, from a block over, they heard the high and joyous laughter of children. I hear kids, he said. Don't you? She looked at him, troubled. He opened the lunchroom door and stepped into dry antiseptic heat. The floor was dusty. The sheen on the chrome was dull. The wooden blades of the ceiling fan stood still. Empty tables. Empty counter stools. But the mirror behind the counter had been shattered and there was something else. In a moment he had it. All the beer taps had been broken off. They lay along the counter like bizarre party favors. Vicky's voice was gay and near to breaking. Sure, ask anybody. Pardon me, sir, but could you tell me? Before we continue with this next bit, I just want to point out, again, gay in this situation means happy. Not what it means nowadays. Moving on. Oh, shut up. But his voice was dull and without force. They were standing in the bar of dusty sunlight that fell through the lunchroom's big plate glass window. And again he had that feeling of being watched, and he thought of the body of the boy they had in their trunk, and of the high laughter of children. A phrase came to him with no reason, a legal sounding phrase, and it began to repeat mystically in his mind. Sight unseen, sight unseen, sight unseen. His eyes traveled over the age-yellowed cards thumbtacked up behind the counter. Cheeseburg, 35 cents. World's Best Joe, 10 cents. Strawberry rhubarb pie, 25 cents. Today's special, ham and red-eye gravy with mashed pot. I'm sorry, but the way I know they mean mashed potatoes, but the way they uh but the way they shortened the potato, what was to be for potatoes, is just funny to me. So anyway, mashed pot, 80 cents. How long since he had seen lunchroom prices like that? Vicky had the answer. Look at this, she said shrilly. She was pointing at the calendar on the wall. They've been at that they've been at that bean supper for 12 years, I guess. She uttered a grinding laugh. He walked over. The picture showed two boys swimming in a pond with a cute little dog carried off their clothes. Below the picture was the legend, Compliments of Gatlin Lumber and Hardware. You break 'em, we fix 'em. The month on view was August 1964. I don't understand, he faltered, but I'm sure. You're sure! She cried hysterically. Sure, you're sure. That's part of your trouble, Bert. You've spent your whole life being sure. He turned back to the door and she came after him. Where are you going? To the municipal center. Bert, why do you have to be so stubborn? You know something's wrong here. Can't you just admit it? I'm not being stubborn. I just want to get shut of what's in that trunk. They stepped out onto the sidewalk and Bert was struck afresh with the town's silence and with the smell of fertilizer. Somehow you never thought of that smell when you buttered an ear and salted it and bit in. Compliments of sun, rain, all sorts of man-made phosphates, and a good healthy dose of cow shit. But somehow this smell was different from the one he had grown up with in rural upstate New York. You could say whatever you wanted to about organic fertilizer, but there was something almost fragrant about it when the spreader was laying it down in the fields. Not one of your great perfumes, God no, but when the late afternoon spring breeze would pick up and waft it over with the freshly turned fields, it was a smell with good associations. It meant winter was over for good. It meant that school doors were going to bang closed in 6 weeks or so and spill everyone out into summer. It was a smell tied irrevocably in his mind with other aromas that were perfume. Timothy grass, clover, fresh earth, hollyhocks, dogwood. But they must do something different out here, he thought. The smell was close, but not the same. There was a sickish sweet undertone, almost a death smell. As a medical orderly in Vietnam, he had become well versed in that smell. Vicky was sitting quietly in the car, holding the corn crucifix in her lap and staring at it in a rapt way Bert didn't like. Put that thing down, he said. No, she said without looking up. You play your games and I'll play mine. He put the car in gear and drove up to the corner. A dead stoplight hung overhead, swinging in a faint breeze. To the left was a near white church. The grass was cut. Neatly kept flowers grew beside the flagged path up to the door. Bert pulled over. What are you doing? I'm going to go in and take a look, Bert said. It's the only place in town that looks as if there isn't 10 years' dust on it. And look at the sermon board. She looked. Neatly penned white letters under glass read, The power and grace of he who walks behind the rose. The date was July 24th, 1976, the Sunday before. He who walks behind the rose, Bert said, turning off the ignition. One of 9,000 names of God only used in Nebraska, I guess. Coming? She didn't smile. I'm not going in with you. Fine, whatever you want. I haven't been in the church since I left home, and I don't want to be in this church, and I don't want to be in this town, Bert. I'm scared out of my mind. Can't we just go? I'll only be a minute. I've got my keys, Bert. If you're not back in 5 minutes, I'll just drive away and leave you here. Now wait just a minute, lady. That's what I'm going to do. Unless you want to assault me like a common mugger and take my keys, I suppose you could do that. But you don't think I will. No. Her purse was on the seat between them. He snatched it up. She screamed and grabbed for the shoulder strap. He pulled it out of her reach. Not bothering to dig, he simply turned the bag upside down and let everything fall out. Her keyring glittered amid tissues, cosmetics, change, old shopping lists. She lunged for it, but he beat her again and put the keys in his own pocket. You didn't have to do that, she said, crying. Give them to me. No, he said, and gave her a hard, meaningless grin. No way. Please, Bert, I'm scared. She held her hand out, pleading now. You'd wait 2 minutes and decide that was long enough. I wouldn't, and then you'd drive off laughing and saying to yourself, that'll teach Bert to cross me when I want something. Hasn't that pretty much been your motto during our married life? That'll teach Bert to come to cross me. He got out of the car. Please, Bert! She screamed, sliding across the seat. Listen, I know. We'll get out of the town and call from a phone booth, okay? I got all kinds of change. I just. We can. Don't leave me alone, Bert! Don't leave me out here alone! He slammed the door on her cry and then leaned against the side of the T-Bird for a moment, thumbs against his closed eyes. She was pounding on the driver's side window and calling his name. She was going to make a wonderful impression when he finally found someone in authority to take charge of the kid's body. Oh, yes. He turned and walked up the flagstone path to the church doors. 2 or 3 minutes just to look around, and he would be back out. Probably the door wasn't even unlocked, but it pushed in easily on silent, well-oiled hinges. Reverently oiled, he thought, that seemed funny for no really good reason. And he stepped into a veritable, so cool it was almost chilly. It took his eyes a moment to adjust to the dimness. Damn. The first thing he noticed was a pile of wooden letters in the far corner, dusty and jumbled indifferently together. He went to them, curious. They looked as old and forgotten as the calendar in the barn grill, unlike the rest of the vegetable, which was dust-free and tidy. The letters were about 2 feet high, obviously part of a set. He spread them out on the carpet. There were 18 of them, and shifted them around like anagrams. Hurt bite crag chap sis. Nope. Crap target chibs huck. That wasn't much good either, except for the ch in chibs. He quickly assembled the word church and was left looking at rap target sibs, kibs, sibs, either way. Foolish. He was squatting here playing idiot games with a bunch of letters while Vicky was going nuts out in the car. He started to get up and then saw it. He formed Baptist, leaving Rag Ek, and by changing those 2 letters he had Grace, Grace Baptist Church. The letters must have been out front. He had taken them down and had thrown them indifferently in the corner, and the church had been painted since then, so that you couldn't even see where the letters had been. Why? It wasn't the Grace Baptist Church anymore. That was why. So what kind of church was it? For some reason, that question caused a trickle of fear, and he stood up quickly, dusting his fingers. So they had taken down a bunch of letters. So what? Maybe they had changed the place in the Flip Wilson's church of what's happening now. What had happened then? He shook it off impatiently and went through the inner doors. Now he was standing at the back of the church itself, and he looked toward the nave. He felt clear. He felt fear close around his heart and squeezed tightly. His breath, his breath drew in. What the hell was that? Did you guys hear that? I can't tell if that sounded like my dog or something else there. Honestly, that made me jump. Hmm. He shook it off impatiently and went through the inner doors. Now he was standing at the back of the church itself, and as he looked toward the nave, he felt fear close around his heart and squeezed tightly. His breath drew in loud in the pregnant silence of this place. The space behind the pulpit was dominated by a gigantic portrait of Christ, and Bert thought, if nothing else in this town gave Vicky the screaming memes, this would. The Christ was grinning, full pine. His eyes were wide and staring, reminding Bert uneasily of Lon Chaney in The Phantom of the Opera. In each of the wide black pupils, someone, a sinner presumably, was drowning in a lake of fire. But the oddest thing was that this Christ had green hair which on closer examination revealed itself to be a twined mass of early summer corn. The picture was crudely done but effective. It looked like a comic strip mural done by a gifted child, an Old Testament Christ or a pagan Christ that might slaughter his sheep for sacrifice instead of leading them. At the foot of the left-hand rank of pews was a pipe organ, and Bert could not at first tell what was wrong with it. He walked down the left-hand aisle and saw with slowly dawning horror that the keys had been ripped up, the stops had been pulled out, and the pipes themselves filled with dry corn husks. Over the organ was a carefully lettered plaque which read, "Make no music except with human tongues, saith the Lord God." Vicky was right. Something was terribly wrong here. He debated going back to Vicky without exploring any further, just getting into the car and leaving town as quickly as possible. Never mind the municipal building, but it grated on him. Tell the truth, he thought. You want to give her band 5,000 to work out before going back and admitting she was right to start with. He would go back out in a minute or so. He walked toward the pulpit thinking, people must go through Gatlin all the time. There must be people in the neighboring towns who have friends and relatives here. The Nebraska SP must cruise through some from time, through from time to time. And what about the power company? The stoplight had been dead. Surely they'd know if the power had been off for 12 long years. Conclusion: what seemed to have happened in Gatlin was impossible. Still, he had the creeps. He climbed the four carpeted steps to the pulpit and looked out over the deserted pews, glimmering in the half shadows. He seemed to feel the weight of those eldritch and decidedly unchristian eyes boring into his back. There was a large Bible on the lectern, open to the 38th chapter of Job. Bert glanced down at it and read, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. The Lord, he who walks behind the rose. Declare if thou hast understanding, and please pass the corn." He fluttered the pages of the Bible, and they made a dry whispering sound in the quiet, the sound that ghosts might make if there really were such things. And in a place like this you could almost believe it. Sections of the Bible had been chopped out, mostly from the New Testament, he saw. Someone had decided to take on the job of amending good King James with a pair of scissors. But the Old Testament was intact. He was about to leave the pulpit when he saw another book on the lower shelf and took it out, thinking it might be a church. Thinking it might be a church record of weddings and confirmations and burials. He grimaced at the words stamped on the cover, done inexpertly in gold leaf. Thus let the iniquitous be cut down so that the ground may be fertile again, saith the Lord God of hosts. There seemed to be one train of thought around here, and Bert didn't care much for the track it seemed to ride on. He opened the book to the first wide lined sheet. A child had done the lettering, he saw immediately. In places an ink eraser had been carefully used, and while there was no misspellings, the letters were large and childishly made, drawn rather than written. The first column read, Amos Dagan, Richard, born September 4th, 1945, September 4th, 1964. Isaac Renfrew, William, born September 19th, 1945, September 19th, 1964. Zephaniah Kirk, George, born October 14th, 1945, October 14th, 1964. Mary Wells Roberta, born November 12th, 1945, November 12th, 1964. Yemen Hollis, Edward, born January 5th, 1946, January 5th, 1965. Frowning, Bert continued to turn through the pages. 3/4 of the way through, the double columns ended abruptly. Rachel Stigman, Donna, born June 21st, 1957, June 21st, 1976. Moses Richardson, Henry, born July 29th, 1957. Malachi Boardman, Craig, born August 15th, 1957. The last entry in the book was for Ruth Clausen, Sandra, born April 30th, 1961. Bert looked at the shelf where he had found this book and came up with two more. The first had the same iniquitous be cut down logo, and it continued the same record, the single column tracing birth dates and names. In early September of 1964, he found John Gilman, Clayton, born September 6th, and the next entry was Eve Tobin, born June 16th, 1965. No second name in parentheses. The third book was blank. Standing behind the pulpit, Bert thought about it. Something had happened in 1964. Something to do with religion and corn and children. Dear God, we beg, dear God, we beg thy blessing on the crop. For Jesus' sake, amen. And the knife raised high to sacrifice the lamb. But had it been a lamb? Perhaps a religious mania had swept them. Alone, all alone, cut off from the outside world by hundreds of square miles of the rustling secret corn. Alone another 70 million acres of blue sky. Alone under the watchful eye of God, now a strange green God, a God of corn grown old and strange and hungry, he who walks behind the rows. Bert felt a chill creep into his flesh. Vicky, let me tell you a story. It's about Amos Dagan, who was born Richard Dagan on September 4th, 1945. He took the name Amos in 1964. Fine Old Testament name. Amos, one of the minor prophets. Well, Vicky, what happened? Don't laugh. Is that Dick Dagan and his friends, Billy Renfrew, George Kirk, Roberta Wells, and Eddie Paulus, among others, they taught religion, and they killed off their parents. All of them. Isn't that a scream? Shot them in their beds, knifed them in their bathtubs, poisoned their suppers, hung them, or disemboweled them for all I know. Why? The corn. Maybe it was dying. Maybe they got the idea somehow that it was dying because there was too much sinning, not enough sacrifice. They would have done it in the corn, in the rows. And somehow, Vicky, I'm quite sure of this, somehow they decided that 19 was as old as any of them could live. Richard Amos Dagan, the hero of our little story, had his 19th birthday on September 4th, 1964, the date in the book. I think maybe they killed him, sacrificed him in the corn. Isn't that a silly story? But let's look at Rachel Stigman, who was Donna Stigman until 1964. She turned 19 on June  21st, just about a month ago. Moses Richardson was born on July 29th. Just 3 days from today, he'll be 19. Any idea what's going to happen to old Moose on the 29th? I can guess. Bert licked his lips, which felt dry. One other thing, Vicky. Look at this. We have Job Gilman, Clayton, born on September 6, 1964. No other births until June 16th, 1965. A gap of 10 months. Know what I think? They killed all the parents. Even the pregnant ones. That's what I think. And one of them got pregnant in October of 1964 and gave birth to Eve, some 16 or 17-year-old girl. Eve, the first woman. He thumbed back through the book feverishly and found the Eve Torben entry. Below it, Adam Greenlaw, born July 11th, 1965. They'd be just 11 now, he thought, and his flesh began to crawl. And maybe they're out there, someplace. But how could such a thing be kept secret? How could it go on? Hmm. How, unless the God in question approved? Oh, Jesus, Bert said into the silence. And that was when the T-bird's horn began to blare into the afternoon. One long, continuous blast. Bert jumped from the pulpit and ran down the center aisle. He threw open the outer vestibule door, letting in hot sunshine dazzling. Vicky was bolt upright behind the steering wheel, both hands plastered on the horn ring, her head swiveling wildly. From all around the children were coming. Some of them were laughing gaily. They held knives, hatchets, pipes, rocks, hammers. One girl, maybe 8, with beautiful long blonde hair, held a jack handle. Brutal weapons, not a gun among them. Bert felt a wild urge to scream out, "Which one of you is Adam and Eve? Who are the mothers? Who are the daughters? Fathers? Sons? Declare if thou hast understanding." It came from the side streets, from the town green, through the gate in the chain link fence, around the school playground, a block further west. Some of them glanced indifferently at Bert, standing frozen on the church steps, and some nudged each other and pointed and smiled. The sweet smiles of children. The girls were dressed in long brown wool and faded sunbonnets. The boys, like Quaker parsons, were all in black and wore round-crowned, flat-brimmed hats. They streamed across the town square toward the car, across lawns. A few came across the front yard of what had been the Grace Baptist Church until 1964. One or two of them almost close enough to touch. "The shotgun!" Bert yelled. "Vicky, get the shotgun!" But she was frozen in her panic. He could see that from the steps. He doubted if she could even hear him through the closed windows. They converged on the Thunderbird. The axes and hatchets and clumps of pipe began to rise and fall. My God, am I seeing this? He thought frozenly. An arrow of chrome fell off the side of the car. The hood ornament went flying. Knives crawled spirals through the side walls of the tires and car settled. The horn blared on and on. The windshield and side windows went opaque and cracked under the onslaught. And then the safety glass sprayed upward in sprayed inward and he could see again. Vicky was crouched back, only one hand on the horn ring now, the other thrown up to protect her face. Eager young hands reached in, fumbling for the lock-unlock button. She beat them away wildly. The horn became intermittent and then stopped altogether. The beaten and dented car's side door was hauled open. They were trying to drag her out, but her hands were wrapped around the steering wheel. Then one of them leaned in, knife in hand, and his paralysis broke and he plunged down the steps, almost falling, and ran down the flagstone walk toward them. One of them, a boy of about 16, with long red hair spilling out from beneath his hat, turned toward him, almost casually, and something flipped through the air. Bert's left arm jerked backward, and for a moment he had an absurd thought that he had been punched at long distance. Then the pain came, so sharp and sudden that the world went gray. He examined his arm with a stupid sort of wonder. A buck and a half pensive jackknife was growing out of it, like a strange tumor. The sleeve of his J.C. Penney sports shirt was turning red. He looked at it for what seemed like forever, trying to understand how he could have grown a jackknife. Was it possible? When he looked up, the boy with the red hair was almost on top of him. He was grinning, confident. Hey, you bastard, Bert said. His voice was creaking, shocked. Remand your soul to God, for you will stand before his throne momentarily, the boy with the red hair said, and clawed for Bert's eyes. Bert stepped back, pulling the pensy out of his arm, and stuffed it into the red-haired boy's throat. The gush of blood was immediate, gigantic. Bert was splashed with it. The red-haired boy began to gobble and walk in a large circle. He clawed at the knife, trying to pull it free, and was unable. Bert watched him, jaw hanging agape. None of this was happening. It was a dream. The red-haired boy gobbled and walked. Now his sound was the only one in the hot early afternoon. The others watched, stunned. This part, this part of it wasn't in the script, Bert thought numbly. Vicky and I, we were in the script, and the boy in the corn who was trying to run away, but not one of their own. He stared at them savagely, wanting to scream, "How do you like it?" The red-haired boy gave one last weak gobble and sank to his knees. He up at Bert for a moment, and then his hands dropped away from the haft of the knife, and he fell forward. A soft sighing sound from the children gathered around the Thunderbird. They stared at Bert. Bert stared back at them, fascinated. And that was when he noticed that Vicky was gone. "Where is she?" he asked. "Where did you take her?" One of the boys raised a blood-streaked hunting knife toward his throat and made a swing motion there. He grinned. That was the only answer. From somewhere in the back, an older boy's voice, soft. "Get him." The boys began to walk toward him. Bert backed up. They began to walk faster. Bert backed up faster. The shotgun. The goddamn shotgun. Out of reach. The sun then cut their shadows darkly on the green church lawn. And then he was on the sidewalk. He turned and ran. "Kill him!" someone roared, and they came after him. He ran, but not quite blindly. He skirted the municipal building. No help there. They would corner him like a rat, and ran on up Main Street, which opened out and became the highway again 2 blocks further up. He and Vicky would have been on that road now, in a way, if he had only listened. His loafers slapped against the sidewalk. Ahead of him he could see a few more business buildings, including the Gatlin ice cream shop, sure enough, the Bijou Theater. The dust-clotted marquee letters read, now howling, ill-limited, and Ageman, Ellie, Taylor, Cleopatra. Beyond the next cross street was a gas station that marked the edge of of town. And beyond that, the corn, closing back into the sides of the road. A green tide of corn. Bert ran. He was already out of breath, and the knife wound in his upper arm was beginning to hurt, and he was leaving a trail of blood. As he ran, he yanked his handkerchief from his back pocket and stuck it inside his shirt. He ran. His loafers pounded the cracked cement of the sidewalk. His breath rasped in his throat with more and more heat. His arm began to throb in earnest. Some mordant part of his brain tried to ask if he thought he could run all the way to the next town. If he could run 20 miles of two-lane blacktop. No. He ran. Behind him he could hear them, 15 years younger and faster than he was, gaining. Their feet slapped on the pavement. They whooped and shouted back and forth to each other. They're having more fun than a five-alarm fire, Bert thought disjointedly. They'll talk about it for years. Bert ran. He ran past the gas station marking the edge of town. His breath gasped and roared in his chest. The sidewalk ran out under his feet, and now there was only one thing to do, only one chance to beat them and escape with his life. The houses were gone. The town was gone. The corn had surged in a soft green wave back to the edges of the road. The green sword-like leaves rustled softly. It would be deep in there, deep and cool, shady in the row of the main of man-high corn. He ran past a sign that said, "You are now leaving Gatlin, nicest little town in Nebraska, or anywhere else. Drop in any time." I'll be sure to do that, Bert thought dimly. He ran past the sign like a sprinter, closing on the tape and then swerved left, crossing the road and kicked his loafers away. Then he was in the corn and it closed behind him, over him like the waves of a green sea, taking him in, hiding him. He felt a sudden and wholly unexpected relief sweep him, and at the same moment he got a second wind. His lungs, which had been shallowing up, seemed to unlock and give him more breath. He ran straight down the first row he had entered, head ducked, his broad shoulders swiping the leaves and making them tremble. 20 yards in he turned right, parallel to the road again, and ran on, keeping low so they wouldn't see his dark head of hair bobbing amid the yellow corn tassels. He doubled back toward the road for a few moments, crossed more rows, and then put his back to the road and hopped randomly from row to row, always delving deeper and deeper into the corn. At last he collapsed onto his knees and put his forehead against the ground. He could only hear his own taxed breath breathing, and the thought that played over and over in his mind was, "Thank God I gave up smoking. Thank God I gave up smoking. Thank God." Then he could hear them yelling back and forth to each other, in some cases bumping into each other. "Hey, this is my row!" And the sound heartened him. They were well away to his left, and they sounded very poorly organized. He took his handkerchief out of his shirt, folded it, and stuck it back in after looking at the wound. The bleeding seemed to have stopped in spite of the workout he had given it. He rested a moment longer and was suddenly aware that he felt good, physically better than he had in years, accepting the throb of his arm. He felt well exercised, and suddenly gripping with the clear cut, no matter how insane, problem after 2 years of trying to cope with the antibiotic gremlins that were sucking his marriage dry. It wasn't right that he should feel this way, he told himself. He was in deadly peril of his life, and his wife had been carried off. She might be dead now. He tried to summon up Vicky's face and dispel some of the odd, good feeling by doing so, but her face wouldn't come. What came was the red-haired boy with the knife in his throat. He became aware of the corn fragrance in his nose now, all around him. The wind through the tops of the plants made a sound like voices, soothing. Whatever had been done in the name of this corn, it was now his protector. But they were getting closer. Running hunched over, he hurried up the row he was in, crossed over, doubled back and crossed over once more, row over more rows. He tried to keep the voices always on his left, but as the afternoon progressed, that became harder and harder to do. The voices had grown faint, and often the rustling sound of the corn obscured them altogether. He would run, listen, run again. The earth was hard packed, and his stockinged left little, their feet left little or no trace. When he stopped much later, the sun was hanging over the fields to his right, red and inflamed, and when he looked at his watch, he saw that it was quarter past 7. The sun had sustained the corn tops a reddish gold, but here the shadows were dark and deep. He cocked his head, listening. With the coming of sunset, the wind had died entirely, and the corn stood still, exhaling its aroma of growth into the warm air. If they were still in the corn, they were either far away or just hunkered down and listening. But Bert didn't think a bunch of kids, even crazy ones, could be quiet for that long. He suspected they had done most of the kid-like thing, regardless of the consequences for them. They had given up and gone home. He turned toward the setting sun, which had sunk between the crafted clouds on the horizon, and began to walk. If he cut a diagonal through the rows, always keeping the setting sun ahead of him, he would be bound to strike Route 17 sooner or later. The ache in his arm had settled into a dull throb that was nearly pleasant, and the good feeling was still with him. He decided that as long as he was there, he would let the good feeling exist in him without guilt. The guilt would return when he had to face the authorities and account for what had happened in Gatlin, but that could wait. He pressed through the corn, thinking he had never felt so keenly aware. 15 minutes later, the sun was only a hemisphere, poking over the horizon, and he stopped again, his new awareness clicking into a pattern he didn't like. It was well, vaguely frightening. He cocked his head. The corn was rustling. Bert had been aware of that for some time, but he had just put it together with something else. The wind was still. How could that be? He looked around warily, half expecting to see the smiling boys in their Quaker coats creeping out of the corn, their knives clutched in their hands. Nothing of the sort. There was still that rustling noise, off to the left. He began to walk in that direction, not having to bowl through the corn any more. The row was taking him in the direction he wanted to go, naturally. The row ended up ahead. Ended? No. Emptied out into some sort of clearing. The rustling was there. He stopped, suddenly afraid. The scent of the corn was strong enough to be cloying. The rows held on to the sun's heat, and he became aware that he was plastered with sweat and chaff and thin spider strands of corn silk. The bugs ought to be crawling all over him, but they weren't. He stood still, staring toward that place where the corn opened out onto what looked like a large circle of bare earth. There were no midges. There were no midges or mosquitoes in here. No black flies or chiggers, what he and Vicky had called driving bugs when they had been corning, he thought with sudden and unexpectedly sad nostalgia. And he hadn't seen a single cow. How was that for weird? A corn patch with no cows. In the last of the daylight, he swept his eyes closely over the row of corn to his left, and saw that every leaf and stalk was perfect, which was just not possible. No yellow blight, no tattered leaves, no caterpillar eggs, no burrows, no. His eyes widened. My God, there aren't any weeds! Not a single one. Every foot and a half of corn plants rose from the earth. There was no witchgrass, Jimson, pipeweed, horsehair, or poke salad. Nothing. Both Bert stared up, eyes wide. The light in the west was fading. The raftered clouds had drawn back together. Before them, the golden light had faded to pink and ochre. It would be dark soon enough. It was time to go down in the clearing in the corn and see what was there. Hadn't that been the plan all along? All the time he had thought he was cutting back to the highway. Hadn't he been leading? Hadn't he been led to this place? Dread in his belly, he went on down to the row and stood at the edge of the clearing. There was enough light left for him to see what was there. He couldn't scream. There didn't seem to be enough air left in his lungs. He tottered on his legs, slats of splintery wood. His eyes bulged from his sweaty face. Vicky, he whispered. Oh, Vicky. My God. She had been mounted on a crossbar like a hideous trophy. Her arms out at the wrists and her legs at the ankles with twists of common barbed wire. 70 cents a yard at any hardware store in Nebraska. Her eyes had been ripped out. The sockets were filled with the moonflax of corn silk. Her jaws were wrenched open in a silent scream, her mouth filled with corn husks. That is a hell of a thought. That is a hell of a thing to be picturing in the head, especially when it's nighttime. That's going to be leaving some people with nightmares. On her left was a skeleton in the moldering surplice. The new jawbone grinned. The eye socket seemed to stare at Bert jocularly, as if the one-time minister of the Grace Baptist Church was saying, "It's not so bad. Being sacrificed by pagan devil children in the corn is not so bad. Having your eyes ripped out of your skull according to the laws of Moses is not so bad." To the left of the skeleton in the surplice was a second skeleton, this one dressed in a rotting blue uniform. A hand a hat hung over the skull, shading the eyes, and on the peak of the cap was a greenish tinged badge reading Police Chief. That was when Bert heard it coming. Not the children, but something much larger, moving through the corn and toward the clearing. Not the children, no. The children wouldn't venture into the corn at night. This was the holy place, the place of He who walks behind the rows. Jerkily, Bert turned to flee. The row he had entered the clearing by was gone, closed up. All the rows had closed up. It was coming closer now, and he could hear it, pushing through the corn. He could hear it breathing. An ecstasy of superstitious terror seized him. It was coming. The corn on the far side of the clearing had suddenly darkened, as if a gigantic shadow had bolted it out. Coming. He who walks behind the rows. It began to come into the clearing. Bert saw something huge, bulking up to the sky. Something green with terrible red eyes the size of footballs. Something that smelled like dried corn husks years in some dark barn. He began to scream, but he did not scream long. Sometime later, a bloated orange harvest moon came up. The children of the corn stood in the clearing at midday, looking at the two crucified skeletons and the two bodies. The bodies were not skeletons yet, but they would be, in time. And here, in the heartland of Nebraska, in the corn, there was nothing but time. Behold, a dream came to me in the night, and the Lord did shew all this to me. They all turned to look at Isaac with dread and wonder, even Malachi. Isaac was only 9, but he had been the seer since the corn had taken David a year ago. David had been 19, and he had walked into the corn on his birthday, just as dusk had come drifting down the summer rose. Now, small-faced grave under his round-crowned hat, Isaac continued. And in my dream, the Lord was a shadow that walked behind the rose, and he spoke to me in the words he used to our older brothers years ago. He is much displeased with this sacrifice. They made a sign, sobbing noise, and looked at the surrounding walls of green. And the Lord did say, have I not given you a place of killing, that you might make sacrifice there? And have I not shown you favor? But this man has made a blasphemy within me, and I have completed the sacrifice myself, like the blue man and the false minister who escaped many years ago. The blue man, the false minister, they whispered, and looked at each other uneasily. So now is the age of favor lowered from 19 plantings and harvestings to 18. Isaac went on relentlessly. Yet be fruitful and multiply as the corn multiplies, that my favor may be shown you and be with you. Isaac ceased. The eyes turned to Malachi and Joseph, the only two among this party who were 18. There were others back in town, perhaps 20 in all. They waited to hear what Malachi would say. Malachi, who had led the hunt for Japheth, who evermore would be known as Ahaz, cursed of God. Malachi had cut the throat of Ahaz, and had thrown his body out of the corn, so the foul body would not pollute it or blight it. I obey the word of God, Malachi whispered. The corn seemed to sigh its approval. In the weeks to come, the girls would make many corncob crucifixes to ward off further evil. And that night, all of those who now above the age of favor walked silently into the corn, and went to the clearing, to gain the continued favor of he who walks behind the rose. Goodbye, Malachi, Ruth called. She waved disconsolately. Her belly was big with Malachi's child, and tears coursed silently down her cheeks. Malachi did not turn. His back was straight. The corn swallowed him. Ruth turned away, still crying. She had conceived a secret hatred for the corn, and sometimes dreamed of walking in it with a torch in each hand when dry September came and the stalks were dead and explosively combustible. But she also feared it. Out there, in the night, something walked, and it saw everything, even the secrets kept in human hearts. Dusk deepened into night. Around Gatlin, the corn rustled and whispered secretly. It was well pleased. And that was Children of the Corn, plus, as well as, I Know What, so that was I Know What You Need, as well as Children of the Corn. Two very long books, I will say that much. Like, they were short stories that honestly could be passed as, novellas of modern times, probably. Yeah. But anyway, so we have two more stories for the next part, and then we will be done. So we're actually on the. So this next part coming up is actually the penultimate part because we got two more parts after the story. So here's what I mean. So for the next part, the two stories are the last run on the ladder, the last run on the ladder, and the man who loved flowers. With the final part having been One for the Road and The Woman in the Room. But yes, that was the 10th part of Night Shift. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Forrest Walpole signing off.